Again, Dr. Craig Hazen, professor of apologetics at Biola University, the director and founder of their apologetics program, one of the sharpest, keenest minds, and most entertaining apologetic speakers out there. Will you please welcome to the platform Dr. Craig Hazen?
Thanks, Ryan. Hey, is it all right if I move this mic out of the way? It's a delicate thing. I'm not going to. Oh. Very good. Get a good look at you first. You look a little more alert this morning than you were last night. Hang in there. Only, 15 more days to go. That's good. Oh, hey, the weather changed suddenly. This is a good sign. I actually saw some sun break through. That's it must be big news. I check the weather report a lot. I travel a lot, and of course you got to check to see if you can put what size coat you need to bring, or if it's an umbrella or something. And I'm going to Idaho next week, and I checked the weather report on the internet, and there was a flashing thing on the weather report that said bear warning. Yeah, haven't seen one of these before. So I guess the weather had changed suddenly, and the bears are confused. Some are coming out of hibernation. So here's I printed out the warning. I want to be prepared when you go to the mountains of Idaho. It says the Forest Service has issued a bear warning in the local forest. They're urging everyone to protect themselves by wearing bells and carrying pepper spray. Can I bring that on the airplane, the pepper spray? This kind of sounds dangerous. It says campers and hikers should be alert for signs of fresh bear activity, and they should be able to tell the difference between black bear dung and grizzly bear dung. I imagine little Idaho school children learn that kind of thing, show and tell. It says, it actually gives us a little help. Black bear dung is rather small and round. Sometimes you can see fruit seeds and or squirrel fur in it. Grizzly bear dung has bells in it and smells like pepper spray. Well, it's on the internet. I have to pay attention to it. Well, I hope you're learning that the Christian faith really can go toe to toe with worldviews and ways of thinking at the top levels of the intellectual spheres and academic spheres, because it really can. And I think you will pick that up along the way during this week. That truly you're not leaving anything behind becoming a Christian in terms of the intellectual life. It's rich, it's full, and it's wonderful. And honestly, you go to enough secular university campuses and you go, what are they even thinking here about this particular issue, I got another college story just to start off. I got an invitation to come and speak at the University of Miami, go Hurricanes, It's a big institution, kind of a football and basketball powerhouse down in the Miami area. Very well known for their scientific research. So some Christian club invited me to give a talk on the campus. In fact, I remember the title was Reconciling Science and Faith. I could do that. But it was actually a popular topic. They advertised it well across campus, especially the people in the scientific research triangle of the university. They were coming out in droves, whether they were Christians or not. Turns out that the students offered them free pizza. This free food operation on college campuses is just a great way to get people in to hear the gospel. So they're offering pizza. And again, not knowing what to expect, it was a fairly crowded lecture hall. I guess the topic and the food attracted them, Let's hear a guy attempt to reconcile science and faith. Well, this is a hostile audience. Just know it's going to be. And so I'm always praying a lot before a hostile audience like this. And so I'm back in the wings, kind of praying up before I go out. And they're getting ready to introduce me. They introduce me and I walk out. I always take a quick look at people, before I start. Maybe I'll change up everything. And when I'm looking at them, I have an idea, Now, I have no idea if it's from God, My wife always knows when it's from God, She hears from God all the time. I have the spiritual sensitivity of plankton, And she's always hearing from God. And most of the time, it's about what I should be doing, you know? But so I get this idea, and here's the idea. Perform a miracle. All right, I'll give it a shot, you know? So I gave just a couple of introductory remarks. Glad to be here, blah, blah, blah. Let's see if we can make some progress in solving this tension between science and faith, so on. Then I said, to get us started, I was thinking that it might be a good idea if, at the outset, I were to, perform a miracle. That was almost exactly, there's kind of a very light, nervous giggle, and I could actually see people looking. And these were all, kind of non-Christian science students, and they were actually calculating vectors, to make it out of the room and grab pizza on the way out in case this thing went south, This guy's going to perform a miracle. Most people, whether Christian or not, they're locked in. They go, what's this guy going to do, So I had a little stage like this, and I remember I just had my toes hanging over the stage like this, and I'm starting to loosen up. Because everybody knows you got to loosen up to perform a miracle, That's how ridiculous this was. No, I'm not kidding. So I'm out here and I'm kind of getting centered, and I open my eyes and everybody's leaning forward. And they're not blinking. They think I'm going to do a magic trick or a backflip or something, And there was a gal right there, and she's got a camera. she's going to try to photograph the miracle. In fact, that's what I said. I actually stopped for a second. Are you going to try to photograph the miracle? And she goes, good luck with that, Actually, I'm not kidding. The next day, on the front page of the Daily Hurricane College newspaper was, "Man performs miracle in science lecture hall." I kid you not. Wish I would have kept a copy of that. So, I'm getting loosened up, getting centered. Other side. Thank you. It's exactly what they did. And then it broke into not silence, but this guy is an idiot. Yeah, one guy is way in the back corner, moron, And I go, I know you're reacting in many different ways to that, because it's not often you see miraculous activity on a secular college campus like this. And they're like, what are you talking about? I said, well, clearly, my arm was at rest, and boom, there it went. It went perpendicular with my body. There was no warning. It just boom, it happened. And they're like, well, and I said, look, I used to teach physics. I know this is a miracle. Newton's, laws of motion indicate that I was a body at rest. And in order for my body to do anything, to make any sort of a position change, there had to have been an outside force. There was no outside force. There was no fishing line, invisible fishing line in the ceiling, pulling my arm up. There was no wind blowing through the lecture hall, blowing my arm up. Nothing like that. It just boom. It's a miracle. They're like, you're an idiot. A couple of people walk out. They grab pizza on the way out. The rest were just kind of shouting. I kind of lost control of the crowd at that moment. I'm thinking, this may not have been from God, So they're yelling at me. And I'm saying, the burden of proof is on you, And they're yelling back, and I can't hear what's going on. There's just so many people talking, so I did kind of lose control. Fortunately, some guy stands up, and this guy was from Central Casting, science guy, He was tall. He had a long white lab coat on. He had overhead projector pens in his pocket. He had glasses sliding down his nose. He was balding a little bit. And because he was tall, it took him a while to stand up. His standing up was a kind of event, He's like, and he gets all the way up, and he's about to say something. And all the students quiet down, because clearly this was Professor so-and-so, probably from the physiology department, given his comment. But then he goes, let me see if I can help, And he goes, what was going on here was, and then he went through this this amazing rendition of the cascade of electrochemical, musculoskeletal activity that takes place in order for an arm to go up. There's C fibers firing, and there's axons, and there's dendrites, and there's synapses with acetylcholine, and there's a line of nerves going out, and out cervical gap X down to the deltoid muscle where it connects. And after there's a certain potassium potential, calcium's released, actin and myosin cross over one another, the deltoid contracts, and the arm goes up. Now, he plodded through this step by step for at least a couple of minutes, and all the students were going, yeah, take that, religion guy, And I said, wow, when he was done. That was fantastic. That was an amazing partial explanation. Can anybody help fill in the gaps for this man? Yeah. And they're like, what are you talking about? What gaps? I go, well, what got all that going, for goodness sakes? We're still back to the same problem. What got all that cascade of electrochemical activity going? What got those C fibers firing in the first place? What was it, You got to be able to explain that. If you can't, it's a miracle. Oh, they'd had it. So I really had lost control of the crowd then. And so I'm like, what am I going to do? And there was a gal sitting in the front row, right next to the gal with the camera, and she's yelling at me. But she's close enough to where I can start to make out the words. She's going, So I focused in, and what she was saying was, you did it. You did it. That was her explanation. And I heard that. I go, everybody, shh. This gal right down here, she has an important thought. Let's hear what she has to say. And then she says it to me. She goes, you did it. I go, tell them. And she stands up and she goes, he did it. And I go, yes. I go, that's exactly right. I did it. See, I am not my body. I am tightly associated with this body. In fact, I can make it do all kinds of things, and so can you. It's really not a miracle. You see, I did it. But the reason you were having trouble with it is because you wanted to bring all of the interesting laws and techniques of physics and chemistry to the problem. And it really can't be solved through the techniques and knowledge of physics and chemistry. This goes beyond those things. You see, what took place was an act of the will. I wanted this to happen. I engaged in an act of the will that set off that wonderful cascade of electrochemical activity that resulted in that deltoid contracting and the arm going up. You see, it's not a miracle after all, but you do have to understand that there are things associated with the human being that are not physical and are not amenable to physical investigation, like through chemistry and physics. But it's as real as can be. There are real things that are not amenable to that kind of study. And see, that all I did there was crack open the door. Right? I cracked open the door for a dialogue about things that might not be physical, things that might be real that really aren't amenable to the study of physics and chemistry or those laws and so on. And then we just had a robust time. I had nothing else to say. It was just Q&A and batting around ideas. And I remember how it ended. It was kind of strange. They all went to get pizza, and then there was a line of people just wanted to ask me personal questions. And I'm not kidding, but the first 5 or 6 guys were young men, probably freshmen at the college, freshmen science majors or computer science majors, and they were all carrying their laptops open. And most of them wanted to convince me that their laptop was some sort of living being, Oh, these guys needed a date real bad, That's all I can remember. I was thinking, oh, these poor guys, Anyway, but notice, the Christian worldview walks with that knowledge all the time. We've got souls. We have minds. These are non-physical components of the human being that are as real as can be and make perfect sense to believe in. You really can't do a very good job explaining this, especially the initiation of that activity, without some sort of act of the will, which is not a physical entity. So, just to show you, the Christian worldview can really handle this kind of stuff. But that opens the door for getting into all kinds of interesting religious questions. And this morning's lecture is actually focused on the resurrection. But something that these things all have in common is a certain kind of expectation on a secular university campus. what they were expecting when they came into that room, the reconciliation of science and faith, for instance, they were thinking faith. I know what that is. And by the way, this is very important. This people ask me often, what is the most important question in apologetics? This might be the most important issue. And it is, what is faith? The secular world thinks that faith equals blind leaping. Faith equals blind leaping. In other words, faith is devoid of knowledge. Faith, in some respects, is the opposite of knowledge. Right? And that's what, when they find out you're some sort of religious person, you go into that category. Oh, here's a person who really doesn't have knowledge. They have a lot of feelings, a lot of inner insights and things, but there's nothing objective going on here. There's no real knowledge involved. You see? And that needs to be overcome. And by the way, here's a bigger problem for you brothers and sisters in Christ. In your own churches, about every third or second person in each pew thinks the same thing as the world does about faith. They also think it's blind leaping and that knowledge really has nothing to do with it. You know, in fact, knowledge can be a big impediment to moving forward in true faith, which is blind leaping. So, we need to overcome that. So, the presentation I'm going to do on the resurrection is the kind of thing I present on college campuses and secular forums and so on. And you will have heard some of this before. In fact, you've had Gary Habermas at this conference a number of years, you know, and since he's not here, I'll kind of fill in. I'm going to use some Habermasian techniques for presenting the evidence for the resurrection. So you may have heard some of this before, but what I want you to focus in on is the scientific texture of it all. And so I present it in the way I do on secular campuses, and I'm giving you that presentation, because I've noticed that they pick up on the scientific texture, and they don't exactly know what to do with it, because they know science carries with it knowledge. But guess what? Religion isn't supposed to. But here's this religious guy talking about some religious event called the resurrection, and it has such a strong scientific texture to it. All right, so pay attention to that. Oh, by the way, there is a handout. And you probably don't have a handout, do you, folks? There's a whole, there they are. There's a stack of them right there. It's a good time to hand it out. I won't be referring to it for a moment or two. Oh, back to the issue of faith briefly. Listen to this. This is an op-ed piece written in the Los Angeles Times by an engineering professor at the University of Southern California. His name's Bart Costco. And here's what he wrote back a few years ago. He wanted to help us out with our definition of faith because he's an engineering professor and that's his specialty, faith, right? Just check this out. He says, faith is unwarranted belief. Faith is belief without evidence or despite evidence to the contrary. Faith occurs when a person believes that something is true even though he suspects it's false. It takes large doses of such faith to support the very existence of casinos, psychic hotlines, astrology columns, mall Santas, and most organized religions. Is that what we believe? Oh my goodness. By the way, if this is the kind of thing we believed, I would not be a Christian. I'd go, oh well, good try, folks. You know, keep up with that blind faith business. Faith is unwarranted belief. Faith is belief without evidence or despite evidence to the contrary. That is the kind of operating definition out in the world, and unfortunately that's also an operating definition by many people in our churches, and we need to help them with that. One way to do that is just to show them that the Christian faith is indeed a testable operation, and it all centers on that resurrection of Jesus. Last night I read to you a passage I called the strangest passage in all of religious literature. And I really believe this. I've never seen anything like this in great sacred texts. Where last night I said that if Jesus did not come back from the dead, your faith is worthless. If Jesus did not come back from the dead, your faith is empty, of no account, and so on. It's futile. Paul says it twice just to make sure we catch on to this, that this is that important. So really, Christianity hangs by a thread, the thread of the resurrection. right? There it is, the threat of the resurrection. And Paul actually invites people to come along and try to snip that thing, right? Now, turns out that thread, in my view, is made out of some sort of super titanium alloy that breaks any pair of scissors that gets near it. So we're in pretty good shape. But honestly, the idea that we need to defend the faith makes a lot of average people in our churches very nervous. Because most religions aren't subjected to that, but Christianity is. So it behooves us to be prepared always to give an answer, especially on this particular topic. All right, the resurrection. My apologies to Gary Habermas if I get any of this wrong, but here we go. Back in the day, when I had become a Christian back in the late 1970s, I was so grateful that there were people who, they may not have had answers for me, but they knew how to shove books in my hand, or cassette tapes back in the day, or tell me what radio programs to listen to. And I discovered there were a lot of pretty thoughtful people out there who'd worked through some of the same issues that I was having as a very new Christian, looking for some solid answers. One book in those days that they would have shoved in your hand would have been Evidence That Demands a Verdict, or More Than a Carpenter, books by Josh McDowell. Both of those have extensive sections on the resurrection of Jesus. And the technique used in those books, and the technique that was the method of the day, was to do this, to spend some time establishing the trustworthiness of the New Testament documents. I mean, you really work hard showing that the New Testament documents came forth from either eyewitnesses or from close associates of eyewitnesses, that they were written early and they pushed right back on the time of these events. And so even if you were to bring these in a court of law, a judge would have to admit them into evidence because they're that kind of excellent documents and testimonies. So you start there. And then once the New Testament documents are admitted into evidence, then you can make your case for the resurrection of Jesus from those documents. By the way, that is a perfectly sound technique, right? That makes perfect sense. You want to establish the reliability of your primary source documents, and then you want to make your case for the resurrection from those. So that's not a problem at all. There's a practical issue with that technique today. Let's say you were to go to a local secular university and you've been invited to speak to the atheist club or some philosophy club or something, and they actually want you to talk about your views on the resurrection. And let's say you spend the first, you're planning to spend the first 20 minutes establishing the reliability of the New Testament documents. So you pull out a Bible, and how does the crowd react? Excuse me, what are you doing? Bringing out a Bible? By the way, we don't really like the reading of the Bible on this campus because, it's homophobic, it's violent, it's misogynist, it's greedy, and it's just a kind of a horrible text. We'd rather have that not read. And so how are you going to make progress if their first attitude is that book is simply not trustworthy? It doesn't matter what kind of case you're going to make because of its attitude towards women, gays, and its violent attitude and its promotion of genocide and all kinds of things. The deck is stacked against us in rather dramatic fashion. Well, that's terrible. What are we going to do? Well, this is where the creative people of God kick in. Now, we're not going to dilute and toss out the scriptures, but what if we simply find an end run around this problem we've run into? In my view, this is what Gary Habermas did in his doctoral dissertation work at Michigan State University. He developed a technique where we don't necessarily have to open the Bible in front of people and make the case for the reliability of Scripture. Rather, we can actually let secular scholars and unbelievers of all sorts, scholars of all stripes, make the case for us. And so this is an effective technique in this day. It may not be an effective technique 25 years from now, but right now it's very effective. Here's the Habermas technique, which is a little bit different. Rather than opening the scriptures on the secular campus, I simply open the academic journals and important textbooks and monographs on these issues written by people who have top degrees in the fields of biblical studies, ancient Mediterranean studies, Greco-Roman history, ancient languages and so on. People who have written shelves full of books on these topics, who, by the way, may not be believers. Some are. A good number of them aren't. And so we can read back maybe 25 years, maybe 50 years in English and German and French, all the languages of this particular scholarly endeavor, and try to catalog what it is that everybody seems to have in common with regard to their basic facts, the bedrock facts regarding Jesus and his resurrection. And guess what? This is possible to do. You read through the material, you glean the things that they would tend to all agree with, and you write that down. And you use that as your starting point. You see the technique there? So I'm not opening up the Bible, I'm opening up scholarly journals and so on, and it's easy to make the case that what we have here is the consensus of scholarly opinion on the issue of the historical Jesus and his crucifixion and his resurrection. So that's where we're going with this. Well, when we do comb through all of these journals and textbooks of these scholars, what do we come up with? This is where your handout's going to come in handy. You're going to want to look at the 12 known historical facts column. 12 known historical facts. Now, the facts listed here are of a particular texture. Gary Habermas would call them minimal facts. They're not long, they're not embellished, because the moment you start adding a lot of details, scholars fall off the wagon. They no longer would agree with these particular facts. So, the vast majority of critical scholars would tend to agree with these. Number 4 may not make it to the top tier, but it's not bad still. It's still the majority. So let me read through these, and I'll make a few comments about them as we go. But this is the bedrock material that we're going to use. If we were field scientists, we'd be out observing butterflies or the movement of the celestial bodies or something and cataloging it. That's what we've done here with regard to the historical Jesus and his purported resurrection. We've studied all the material and we've cataloged what turns out to be bedrock facts, the things that we might expect theories to answer. So, number 1, the first of the 12 known historical facts. Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus died by crucifixion. By the way, right off the bat, Jesus was a real historical figure. Okay, this is assumed in point number 1. And yes, modern scholars, even of a critical secular sort, do believe that Jesus really existed. The folks on the internet who simply say, they start with the fact that there's no good reason to believe that Jesus existed, really need to go get a life. They're just not on the right scholarly track. People who do not believe that Jesus was the Son of God or resurrected from the dead or anything, think it's just completely historically obvious that Jesus was a real historical figure. So Jesus existed, and he died by crucifixion. Of course, you can get really clever with the old idea about Jesus not existing. There was a scholar at Harvard. He actually did his doctoral dissertation on this topic. He didn't think Jesus really existed as a physical human being. Rather, Jesus was a code word for hallucinogenic mushrooms. And so basically, the whole Jesus movement got started when people were popping too many shrooms and going off on wild psychedelic journeys and imagining all kinds of miraculous things. And they were writing this down, just like the Beatles, writing lyrics. Lucy in the sky with diamonds, Jesus is a mushroom. So there's just craziness, okay? We don't need to go there. Oh, speaking of mushrooms. By the way, I'm an old biologist, did research biology for a while. Right outside here along this walkway, you'll see on the right-hand side if you're walking this direction, some lovely fungus that you don't see every day. I mean, it's got a weird cream color. Looks like a dog got sick along the way. Now, that's totally fascinating too. You should go out and study that fungus that's growing on the lawn there. You can't miss it. Right? Please don't miss it. It's one of God's wonderful creations. So go check it out. Jesus died by crucifixion. He didn't almost die. He died. Why are modern scholars so keen on the idea that Jesus died? Because they've studied a little bit about crucifixion. And not only that, they've actually crucified people in graduate physiology laboratories to see what the physiological effects are when a person gets crucified. Now they didn't really, drive nails through their wrists and feet and so on, but, they could tie a person to a crossbeam and kind of let them dangle, or give them a little peg to stand on with their arms way up. And they can get a sense for, how it affects your breathing and your heart, and we can get reports of pain and all kinds of stuff. And it turns out that being crucified, or being just put in that crucifixion position, is incredibly distressing. Right? In fact, it's very difficult to breathe if you're hanging with your arms way up in the sky. It's difficult to get your diaphragm to depress and your intercostal muscles to expand and get that negative pressure that causes the air to come in. It's also hard to expel it, You have terrible trouble breathing. In fact, when you die from crucifixion, you generally die from asphyxiation. It's not from, bleeding out or something, unless they hit one of the, arteries or something with their bad nail driving. So it turns out that they actually, by studying crucifixion in physiology laboratories, you can discover that, wow, people definitely will die from this. And if they're not given opportunities to push up to get a decent breath and go back down, they're going to die within, minutes, certainly within hours. So if you don't see a person pushing up to get good air exchange, they're probably not getting enough air to live. And so if a person is just hanging on a cross in Roman times, they're not pushing up for any air, there's a good chance they're gone. In fact, you just let them hang there for a good 25 minutes to an hour, and they're gone. So it was very good at killing people and knowing that they're dead. In fact, this is actually this is illustrated in the Gospel of John. You remember what they were going to do to the prisoners in order to hasten their death before the time of the Sabbath? They were commanded to go and break their legs. They're going to smash their, tibia and fibula. They're going to come with a billy club and just go pap, 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 Guess what? By the time your legs are broken and you still need to push up to get that breath, after you try that once or twice, you go, forget it, man, I'm dying. I'm not going to do that anymore. It was excruciating. Right? Which is a Latin term for the cross. We actually have a term derived about intense pain based on that. So Jesus died by crucifixion. All right, number 2. He was buried. He was buried. Notice the minimal texture of that particular fact. He was buried in one way or another. Some people think there was a common pit grave. Some people think it might have been an unknown tomb. Some people think, in fact, I think this might very well make the list right now. Some people think that Jesus was buried in the rock-hewn tomb just outside of the walls of Jerusalem, owned by a member of the Sanhedrin by the name of Joseph of Arimathea. Now, that's pretty specific. That is certainly not a minimal fact. That's a fairly detailed fact. But scholars have excellent reason to think that that is really the case. I don't know if it really crosses the threshold of making it into the minimal facts, but it probably could. But we don't need to go there at this point. He was buried in one way or another is a legitimate and accepted part of the story. Number 3. Jesus' death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope, believing that his life was ended. He had a merry band of followers, and they lost hope. They were despondent. They were bummed out to the max, etc. Number 4. Get this. The tomb was discovered to be empty just a few days later. In all fairness, number 4 probably doesn't reach the level of virtually all scholars, agree with this. But certainly the majority do. And the reason they think the empty tomb needs to be part of the story, because it pops up in every source that these critical scholars think are important. And so you got to deal with the empty tomb in one way or the other. So it really ought to be on the list. The tomb was discovered to be empty just a few days later. By the way, just because you have an empty tomb does not mean you have a resurrected Jesus. It simply means you have an empty tomb that needs to be explained. It certainly suggests something supernatural could have happened, but not necessarily. Number 5. The disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus. Now, you wouldn't expect that to be a minimal fact accepted by virtually all critical scholars, you know. The disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus. Gerhard Ludemann, the German scholar, you probably had him here for the Greer Herd Forum. Gerhard Ludemann, he took this so seriously, he wrote a whole book on it, thinking that these hallucinations really explain the whole thing. He thought these were the real deal. There's enough evidence to think that this really happened. The disciples had experiences. Ludemann wasn't interested in particularly going to the point of talking about a real resurrected Jesus, but he certainly thought that the hallucinations or these experiences had to be explained in some way. So number 5 is fairly powerful. Number 6, I'm not sure I need the rest of the facts, honestly. Number 6 is so powerful, you might want to put a little star by it or something. Number 6. The disciples were transformed from doubters who were afraid to identify themselves with Jesus to bold proclaimers of his death and resurrection. Right? So there were disciples, and there was some sort of transformation that took place in their lives. They were kind of hiding and cowering, and not long after that, they're out, woohoo, Jesus is alive, and I don't care what you do to me. What's that about, In fact, later renditions of this particular fact, Gary Habermas said, and some of them went on to die for this belief, right? And that's a very powerful point. You don't just run out and throw your life away for something you know to be untrue. By the way, one of my colleagues, Sean McDowell, I talked about Josh McDowell earlier. This is Sean McDowell, his son, who's better looking and smarter, and will be here later in the week. And I am his warm-up act. He's just delightful. But he just finished his doctoral dissertation last year and had it published. And it's called The Fate of the Apostles. And he basically looked into this question because the fate of the apostles is very important for a testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. And so he went through all 12 to find out what the historical record says happened to these guys. A study like that hadn't been done in years, and so he took it up and did a bang-up job. And he said, oh yeah, there's good reason to believe for sure that 3 of them went to their deaths proclaiming the resurrection, not recanting for a second. And pretty good evidence that more did, and scattered evidence that all of them did. So ask him about that. But that's a very powerful point. Some people among those disciples, we know we're pretty historically certain that they went and gave their lives and never recanted this resurrection business. So that's interesting. How do you explain that transformation that took place from people who were afraid to identify themselves with Jesus to bold proclaimers of his death and of his resurrection? Number 7, this message, that is the resurrection message, was the center of preaching in the early church. Right? It kind of dominated the message. In fact, if you're a member of the early church, you might get kind of tired of it. Yeah, we heard this already. Yes, Jesus is back from the grave. Heard it, been there, talked about it. They really were obsessed with it. I remember as a young Christian reading through the New Testament thinking, wow, these guys are really, they're really hepped up on this Jesus came back from the dead thing. They seem to be obsessed with the idea. I think they were. But this begs the question, what in the world, then, if the resurrection did not actually happen, how did it become the center point of preaching in the early church? There were so many other things that could have been highlighted from the ministry and words of Jesus, Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and so on, and your neighbor as yourself. All kinds of wonderful teachings that Jesus gave that could have become the center point. But no, it was the resurrection that dominated. So that needs to be explained. And by the way, a good way to explain the special obsession and center point of preaching being the resurrection, one good way to explain that is, it really happened. So just keep that in mind. Number 8, this message, again, the resurrection message, was especially proclaimed in Jerusalem, where Jesus died and was buried shortly before. Well, why is that important? Well, it gives kind of a geographical location. It gives, if the legends about Jesus and his resurrection had arisen in Antioch or say Alexandria or Rome or someplace, you can understand it a little more. They're far removed from the location. You think a legend could actually gain a little more traction in a far off place, but no. These things were proclaimed in Jerusalem so that if people are going, I don't believe that for a second, I'm going to check it out, they could actually go do that. They could interview people, they could talk to people, they could check the tomb, the whole business. So you can see how that could be powerful. The idea that it was proclaimed in Jerusalem and the plug wasn't pulled on the whole thing means something. Number 9. As a result of this preaching, the church was born and grew. This is a puzzlement to people who I would call historical sociologists, especially sociologists of religion, who try to explain things like, how did Islam get started? Now, the beginning of Islam isn't that big a mystery, when if you got a religious message to proclaim and you raise an army to go and subjugate people surrounding you and spread your religion, that makes a lot of sense, In fact, it's not particularly puzzling that Islam spread from region to region in that manner. But in Christianity, it's a little bit different. This was a religion of persuasion. You go out and you present your message and you hope people turn and believe. So it's very difficult to understand how the church was born and how it grew. How did it get that initial traction? Well, here's one way it did. Jesus actually came back from the dead. Guess what? It's a whole different ballgame now, folks. If he lives now, he has promised the same for me if I put my faith in him. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to do my best to proclaim this thing. They're going to threaten me. They're going to try to stone me, cut my head off, you name it. I know this is going to happen, but it doesn't matter because I will live forever. That is a religion of persuasion that can really gain traction because the people who are offering up that message are fearless and are willing to go anywhere to proclaim it. That is a good explanation for how the church was born and how it grew. Number 10. Some people say that 10 might be as strong as number 6. Sunday became the primary day of worship. Why is that important? Well, the earliest Christians were Jewish converts. And Jewish converts normally worshiped on the traditional Sabbath, sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. And that tradition had been going on for thousands of years. There's probably nothing that could have been more deeply ingrained in a person's practice or in their culture than participation in Sabbath worship. But suddenly you've got a group of Jewish people who are now followers of Christ stepping over to the first day of the week. Why? Because it memorializes the resurrection of Jesus, which took place on the first day of the week. And they start worshiping on Sunday. You have to understand, that is a huge shaking. Something must have shaken their world in order to get them to do that, to maybe leave behind this cultural practice over here and step into a new one. That is radical and very powerful. Something big happened in their midst. Number 11 and 12 are very similar. James, who had been a skeptic, was converted to the faith when he also believed he saw the resurrected Jesus. And 12, a few years later, Paul was converted by an experience which he likewise believed to be an appearance of the risen Jesus. All right. Now, let me remind you where these came from. This did not come from the tape recordings of the Evangelical Theological Society. These came from the writings, journal articles, monographs, edited works and so on of people who have top degrees in this field, whether they're Christians or not, across the board. And these go back, studies that go back, 25 or even 50 years. This is pretty solid bedrock material about the historical Jesus and the purported resurrection. So there you've got it. Now, what do we do with this? Well, we're good scientists, are we not? If we've got this wonderful body of data that most scholars tend to agree with, well, our next step in the process, if we're good scientists, is to find a theory, that can capture all of this. I want a theory that can make sense of all this, and not leave any of these pieces out, or at least find one that leaves the fewest out. That's our goal next. So next, what we want to do is take a look at various theories, and there's a finite number of them that have come down through the centuries. And so we'll take a look at a few of these. I won't go through all of them, but you'll see, I don't know if it's on a different page or if it is on the back side, but it's this handy dandy resurrection chart that everybody should own. By the way, I do bump into people who had something like this. It's all tattered and worn, and it's been in their Bible for 12 years or something, and they bring it out to show me. They actually use it on a regular basis to share their faith, which I think is actually a really powerful tool. You can see from this chart, we start at the top, it says, which theory best fits the data about the resurrection claims? And it says the tomb of Jesus was either occupied or it was empty. There's a little notation at the top. Not enough evidence to make a judgment. Sometimes you bump into skeptics who goes, who could possibly know anything about that time? There's not enough data to make a judgment. Then you have to throw out most of what you know about classical antiquity. Why? Because the evidence we're talking about here is better attested than most of the things you bump into if you're studying, Homer or Thucydides or Plato or Herodotus or something like that. So you got to throw out. It's a little painful point to keep people in the mix. Reminds me of a debate one of my old professors, John Work Montgomery, engaged in the University of British Columbia. He was debating a philosopher by the name of Avram Stroll, and Montgomery's making the point that. Look, the evidence is so good for the historical Jesus and for the resurrection that if you're not going to buy that evidence, you first have to throw out everything you know about classical antiquity. And Avram Stroll was a philosopher, not a classicist, so he didn't care. He goes, well, let's just throw it out then. And the fellow who was the head of the classics department at the University of British Columbia stood up in the audience and goes, good Lord, Avram, not that, He saw his whole discipline going down the tubes. So we've got this occupied tomb theories and an empty tomb theories. We've got natural versions of empty tomb theories and supernatural versions of empty tomb theories. Then what we have in the next line down are various names of theories like unknown tomb, wrong tomb, legend, twin, hallucination, and so on. And then the fun feature of this particular chart is you can run down to the numbers below. The numbers correspond to the numbers that we just looked at, the 12 known historical facts. If a number appears there, that's a fact that does not fit that particular theory. So we want to clean up those numbers. We want it to say none, all data fits, you see. So that's what we're looking for. So, and like I said, there are a finite number of theories. I'm not going to go over all these. Some of these are completely cockamamie, but some have weathered time and still pop in and out of scholarly circles. So we'll take a look at a few of these and then see how it matches up with the data. Let's start with the one to the far left of your sheet, the unknown tomb theory. This is what it says. The body of Jesus was buried in a common pit grave unknown to his disciples. Therefore, the resurrection account arose out of the ignorance as to the whereabouts of the body. Yeah. I don't see anybody leaping to their feet going, glory, hallelujah. That's really not a very good theory. It's not particularly intriguing. I really need to take it off the list. And it doesn't do very well with the facts either. Look at how it misses here. It misses on data point 4. The explanation that best fits the accepted facts concerning these accounts is that, wrong number 4. The tomb was discovered to be empty just a few days later, and so on. Now, it does get numbers 1, 2, and 3, right? That Jesus died by crucifixion, that he was buried in some way or another, and that his disciples were in despair and had lost hope, believing that he was dead. So it gets those, but it misses on numbers 4 through 12. How does it explain James and Paul having visions of the resurrected Jesus? How does it explain Sunday becoming the primary day of worship? It doesn't do much at all to explain those important things that need to be explained. So it's not a very good theory. Well, let's move on to the next one. As you can see, the wrong tomb theory is one data point better than the unknown tomb theory. The wrong tomb theory says this: the women came to the wrong tomb, for there were many similar tombs in Jerusalem. They found an open tomb and a young man who denied that this was Jesus' tomb. The frightened women mistakenly identified the man as an angel and fled. Right, again, it's probably not rocking your world, but as you can see, it's at least one data point better than the previous theory. And it actually explains the empty tomb, right? The women went to the wrong tomb, right? By the way, I think we established that this is not plausible last night when we established that women wouldn't have gone to the wrong tomb because women asked for directions, right? And so they would have gone to the right tomb. So this one's really thrown out right at the outset. I mean, I could totally imagine Peter going to the wrong tomb. You know, dude, I totally know where it is, you know. But not the women. So, but notice it still misses on data points numbers 5 through 12. It doesn't explain the disciples having experiences, how they were transformed, how the resurrection became the center point of preaching, James and Paul having experiences of the risen Jesus, and so on. It's not a particularly helpful theory. Now, here's a beauty. Notice the next one misses on all 12 cylinders. This is a pitiful, pitiful theory. Pitiful. It's called the legend theory. And it's by far the most popular. That's the thing that galls me. This is the most popular theory, but it's absolutely the worst in dealing with the known historical facts. Legend theory simply says the resurrection was a fabrication that evolved over a lengthy period to vindicate a leader long since dead. Right? It's a legend. It's like Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. You know, it's one of those things. And you could totally imagine how this would happen. You know, Jesus probably existed in one form or another. He probably just had a really wonderful way about him, and people liked him. And maybe when he held your hand, you'd always feel better. So he was kind of a healer in that sense. And he could heal emotional ills and kind of, you know, encourage people and make them feel better. Of course, by the time the stories are told about this wonderful man after several generations around campfires, you know, you can imagine the legend grows up. Suddenly he's walking on water and he's multiplying loaves and fishes and he's healing the sick and he's raising the dead, coming back from the dead himself. It's a legend. We know how these things developed. You know, I wouldn't even get into arguments with people on the legend theory because then they want to move into all kinds of directions. I simply say, you know, here's the problem. There are like 12 known historical facts agreed upon by the vast majority of critical scholars, and this misses on all of them. Clearly, you can do better than that, you know. It puts the burden on them. You know, look, this is not a legend. We've got some data to work with. You're just going to have to do better than just tossing it all aside and calling it a legend. The next theory is a little intriguing. It does better than most. It only misses on 2 data points, and it's the twin theory. The twin theory. Another possible name for this particular theory could be the bad Mexican soap opera theory, you know. Because this theory basically says, Jesus died and was buried, but soon thereafter his long-lost identical twin brother emerges on the scene and is worshipped as the risen Christ. Right? All right, with me on that? So I'm saying it misses on data points numbers 4 and 11. Number 4 is quite obvious. Number 4 says that the tomb was discovered to be empty just a few days later. Well, if Jesus A was crucified and put in the tomb, Jesus B, his identical twin brother, appears on the scene 3 days later. Where is Jesus A? Presumably still in the tomb, so it doesn't really answer that particular point. Number 11 is a little more intriguing. Number 11 is James, who had been a skeptic, was converted to the faith when he also believed he saw the resurrected Jesus. Now, why is that one interesting? Yeah, James was his brother. Oh, really? And so my wife had twins. I don't think she would forget that there were twins, you know, especially when one of them is dragged off by wolves from the manger, you know, and raised in a different land or something, you know. So, I mean, you have to think about this craziness. So Jesus, A, is crucified, and they take him down. He's dead. They put him in the tomb, and Jesus B appears on the scene. Now, I write conspiracy on the bottom because you have to get this guy into town just at the right moment. So Jesus B enters in, and I got to tell you, he looks a little different because he was raised in a different region. He has a little different dialect. He's got a farmer's tan rather than a carpenter's tan, you know. And so he looks a little different. His hair color's a little off, you know. And so James goes up to him and goes, yeah, hey, Jesus, good to see you. glad you're back from the dead. And Jesus goes, yeah, good to be here. And James goes, hey, remember Dad? Remember when Dad used to eat spaghetti? You know, he'd get a big plate of noodles, pour a lot of sauce on it. He'd take one of those noodles, he'd put it in his mouth, and he'd suck on it real hard. You know? And it would dislodge from the plate and it would start spinning and cover us all in spaghetti sauce. You remember that, Jesus? And Jesus goes, oh, yeah, that was the best, James. And James goes, gotcha. Dad hated spaghetti, you know? That's an illustration of the kind of, interrogation technique, you could do to ferret out the truth. There were tons of those particular kinds of things that could have helped discover the truth about this. The twin theory is not bad, but it still doesn't climb to the level of credibility. I could tell a couple of stories about the twin theory. I helped set up a debate between William Lane Craig and a fresh PhD graduate from the University of California, Irvine, on the twin theory. I way overshot my, the big guns with William Lane Craig. We did not need him for that debate. He turned this guy into like some sort of powder on the stage. It was just terrible. But I won't go through many of these. There's the hallucination theory, which misses on 5, 11, and 12. Basically, 5, 11, and 12, we're talking about different people who have seen the risen Jesus. And hallucinations, and one reason the hallucination theory has fallen out of favor is because hallucinations are very idiosyncratic things, and people don't have, they're not hallucinating the same kinds of things. And here you've got people hallucinating the same kinds of things, and it's fallen out of favor, both with biblical scholars, historians, and with the psychological community. There's the existential resurrection, kind of a la Bultmann or somebody, where, you ask me how I know he lives within my heart. He lives in my experience and so on. Well, that really isn't dealing with any of the known historical facts. It's not really what we're talking about. There's the spiritual resurrection, that Jesus rose in spirit, not in his body. None of these are particularly plausible. There's plenty of cultists running around with such ideas. Then we move across the divide into the empty tomb theories. We've got things like the disciples stole the body. Well, that's literally the oldest one in the book, right? That's actually in the Gospel of Matthew. And it didn't convince anybody then, didn't convince people now. The authorities at the time hid the body. That never convinced anybody, and I really need to remove that because nobody's thought that a plausible idea. Well, now here's one that we probably ought to address. The swoon theory misses on data points 1 and 6. Right? The swoon theory, it's not in favor right now, but I predict it'll be back in 10 or 20 years. So let's at least hear about this. Jesus did not die on the cross. Rather, he fainted from exhaustion. The cold temperature and the spices revived him. All right, so that's the basic swoon theory. Some of you look old enough to know what the word swoon means. That's what young women did when they'd see Frank Sinatra. They'd faint. And then so Jesus didn't really die on the cross. They nailed him to the cross, and he just fainted. And they really thought he was dead. They could barely detect breathing or a pulse. So they take him down. And they wrap him in spiced linens, the initial wrapping. They put him in the tomb and they close the door. And in the cool of the tomb, with the spices acting like a kind of smelling salts, he wakes up. He looks around. Now, by the way, I'm going to say 14 implausible things, none of which are worse than the last thing I'm going to say. Okay, so suspend your belief for a moment. So Jesus kind of detects where he is in a tomb, and he either tunnels out or he moves the stone, right? And then he either sneaks past the guard or he overpowers them, right? And then he drags himself into Jerusalem, I always picture him like a mummy at this point because he's got these wrappings on. He's coming in, and he starts, he's looking for the disciples. And because he's a male, he doesn't ask for directions. And so he makes a couple of extra laps. He finally discovers where they are, and he knocks on the door. And the disciples go in there. They open the hatch, and they don't see him. Well, that's because Jesus is in such a weakened condition. He has slid down to the stoop, And so they hear a weaker knock a little while later. This time they open the door, and there is Jesus in a heap on the doorstep. What do? Do they go, hallelujah, he is risen indeed. This man has conquered death for all of us. Yeah, no. No, they scoop him up. They put him on a donkey and they take him down to the Jerusalem General Emergency Room and they clear. They just try to get him going again. He's not a savior who conquered death. David Friedrich Strauss back in 1840 pointed this out, and he wasn't a guy who was going to believe in the resurrection immediately. So he said, "Look, this is just not a plausible scenario because these people thought that Jesus was a supreme conqueror of death, and the swoon theory is really not going to get you there." So I'm saying it misses on 2 data points. Misses on data point number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. And number 6, the disciples had a transformation. And there was no transformation in this particular scenario. Well, I'm not going to go over the Passover plot. That is goofiness from the 60s and 70s. 1960s and 70s, in case you're wondering. So we're left with 2. Jesus was an alien or a bodily resurrection. Thank you very much. You probably want to know something about that alien thing. Well, it fits all the facts, so there we are. So I put the alien thing on the list back when I was in grad school because I went to grad school in Santa Barbara. That's kind of a New Age mecca, And they were having a big New Age fair or Whole Earth Expo. I forget what it was. But I went to it because I was a religious studies major, and I thought this was just going to be a cornucopia of crazy ideas. And the first booth I walk into is Wisdom from Ancient Astronauts booth, And there were some guys there who had clearly watched way too much Star Trek, Star Wars, Star whatever, And they were just all into alien beings. And so I saddle up there and I start chatting with them. And I'm just fascinated by what they've got going, They're explaining to me all how there's a cloaked mothership orbiting Earth and could easily, by their advanced technology, pull off all the kinds of things we read about in the New Testament, especially like the resurrection. Think about it. They're just about to pound in the nails to Jesus, and they instantaneously are able to beam him out and beam in an android that looks exactly like him, who is not going to be killed by a couple of nails in the wrist. So there's the alien. The nails go in. He goes, ouch. So he's up on the cross, and at some point they just send down a signal to turn him off. They take him down from the cross. Now he's very heavy, so they're taking him to the tomb and they toss him in. He makes kind of a metallic clunking sound. They seal up the tomb, and then 3 days later they send down another signal to reboot him. And of course, this guy is strong enough to, kick open the tomb, overpower the guard, and present himself as the Lord of Glory. There it is. Now, these guys didn't do nearly as fun a job as I did explaining it, but they were plodding through this. I'm going, oh, tell me more, But then I got this idea. I go, oh my gosh, these guys are actually onto something. They've got the basic scenario correct, but they're just too wrapped up in spacemen. See, Jesus really was an alien, relying on not the cloaked mothership, but the power of the Father to raise him up. And so I started to explain that to these guys. And I started out by saying, I think you guys are onto something. And they're so pleased. Somebody was there paying attention to them, listening to their theories, and even affirming them. And I go, but I think you just got to change a few things. I think you've been watching too much science fiction. Jesus really was an alien, but not the spaceman kind that you're talking about. Because he really did rely on not tractor beams and transporters, but on the power of the Father to bring him back. But once you put it in that context, it shifts from the sort of alien sci-fi genre into the bodily resurrection, which fits all 12 historical facts that we've been working with. It captures them all. Now, at this point, if I'm on a secular college campus, I don't need to say, you see, I've demonstrated the truth of the resurrection for all. Eat pizza. I don't need to say anything like that. See, they've put it together. They go, wow, we've made a great breakthrough if they go, wow, this is way more rational, thoughtful, and scientific than I ever imagined. And that's generally their reaction. Generally, they're kind of blown away. Not because of some razzle-dazzle presentation, but because of the facts of the case. They go, wow. And it's, like I said last night, this sets Christianity apart from the pack in dramatic fashion. And by the way, it's got another wonderful little edge to it too. It solves the problem of death and offers us eternal life. Not only does it show that Jesus might very well be the Son of God and unique Savior of humankind, but he actually did conquer death. And by putting our trust in him, we can indeed live forever. That's the message. We can't lose that inside all these wonderful facts that God has left us. But he has left us a tremendous trail of evidence leading back through history, testifying to the great things he's done on our behalf. And it behooves us to learn some of this so we can make the case. This is the shining star in the Christian faith in terms of demonstration and persuasion and hope. That's all I have to say to you. Thank you.
This is a question in regards to the Gospels. Play devil's advocate with you.
Okay.
Why should I trust the Gospels, specifically an example in Matthew and Mark, when they seem to contradict each other in regards to the resurrection? And I'll show you what I'm talking about. This is Matthew 28, verse 6. It says, "He is not here, for he is risen. He said, 'Come see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee to see where you see him.'" And then in Mark, the last chapter of Mark, it says, kind of in regards to that, the women were astonished and didn't tell anyone of the resurrection. So why should I trust their accounts?
Yeah, well, let me put this back in the context for which I made my presentation. I want you to pay attention to the kind of the scientific texture of it, and doing a presentation like this on a secular campus. See, I don't need to answer that kind of question on a secular campus. I can go, hey, because there could be contradictions and so on in the kinds of things that you're talking about, and it wouldn't really matter for this case about that the resurrection of Jesus might be the very best explanation of capturing all these particular facts. Digging into the scriptures and reconciling passages like that is a decidedly Christian enterprise. That's what Christians need to be concerned about. And by the way, we need to solve those kinds of things. And if anybody wants to solve those kinds of things, there's so many wonderful resources. One of my favorites was a book written by David Wenham called The Easter Enigma. One of the most wonderful books I read in my early Christian academic career. And he just did one of the most wonderful explanations of all the seeming disparate, unconnected facts in the four Gospels that to tell the whole story about Jesus, his crucifixion and his resurrection, and relating all that. It's a completely plausible scenario. See, he may not be right on every point, but he, like a good lawyer, he shows that this thing could have indeed happened in this way. And honestly, if he was a defense attorney, he'd be getting his client off. So I just want to make sure you understand the difference between how I would react to that on a college campus. It wouldn't really matter, because even the critical scholars who are putting together these 12 facts understand there's apparent contradictions like that, but nonetheless they agree with these facts. So it doesn't really matter. We're still going to have the same effect in that the resurrection of Jesus might very well be the thing that does the best explanation of the known historical facts.
Thank you.
It's got to ask a lot of questions. Right?
Roll Tide.
I got two quick questions. The first is, could you speak to through your stories and even when you're up on stage now, it's easy to see how you're very good at disarming people. Could you give wisdom and kind of advice on how we can do that in our lives? And the second one is, how does Islam, what kind of theory on their resurrection and how they get around that? How do you refute that?
Yeah, well, now help me with the first one again. I missed a couple of words of that.
Could you give any tips or advice on how to disarm people?
Yes, by the way, this whole disarming thing is so important. We need to spend more time working on ways to do that. Because sometimes we go in as, I'm going to be, like last night, my whole presentation was something I gave in a college class. And notice I didn't say, here are 5 reasons why Christianity is true. Here's 5 reasons a thoughtful person would entertain Christianity first. You know, I'm not even saying it's true, but now I've got them. They're not thinking of me as some crazy-eyed fundamentalist who's going to just give them my version of religion. Now I'm going to give them something that will help them in their journey. But at the same time, these are all connected with important points that set Christianity apart from the pack. So some of you are creative folks, and I'm so delighted you're learning this, because you can take this as the bedrock material to then use creative techniques that you can teach to the rest of us. We've got to hone our game in terms of getting hearings, and that's going to require being creative. And I think I mentioned last night, those of you who do have writing skills, and you can imagine films. I understand there's a budding film person over here. We actually need you to carry these messages to popular culture for us. As for the second point, we have wonderful experts in Islam here. I suggest you tackle them at lunch or go to one of their sessions and ask them that question. They will do it so much better than I would. But thanks for the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hazen. And everybody give him a warm round of applause for that.
Thank you.